Hi, I'm going to talk to you about research. Goal, role, having an impact, what, why an impact. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the theoretical foundations about what it is we're doing, why we should think about it like that, and how we make it, oh, there you go, a little closer. Nice, okay, and how we make it actually work for us. And it started for me with this. In January 2011, I delivered this, which is the greatest usability report ever written. 27 pages. I don't know if you can see those two little red ones, but it's actually 2 pages of a table of contents. They're hyperlinked. It was really well done, typeset in LaTeX. The problem, of course, was that after I delivered this report, nothing happened. The product didn't change. Nobody cared. I think the CEO looked at it and said, "That looks like good work." So I spent the last 8-ish years trying to figure out where I went wrong there and figuring out a number of other missteps, and want to talk to you about how we can think about doing research so that it actually changes the products that we're working on. So I'll praise this talk with some questions. Sorry, I'm cutting in and out a little bit. I'll phrase this talk with some questions that'll sort of set up each section, and we'll try to answer them and look at it as we go. So the first question that we're going to look at is, what does it actually mean to do research? And then how do we as researchers grow into doing that well? So here's the answer to the first question. This, of course, is the research process, and it is a little bit daunting, but it's actually pretty simple. It's 6 steps that, when you take them in sequence, tend to characterize most of the actions that we do as researchers. And this could be something as simple as a short project that takes a few hours, or a long project that takes months or years. And it's a cycle. It can be nested within itself, but I'll walk you through it really quickly. The first thing that we do as user researchers is find actionable questions. That means we need to figure out what we are figuring out. Then we figure out how to approach those questions. And I think it's a special thing about what we do is that we work with people. We try to understand how people act and how they think. So, devise and socialize plan for finding answers. So another key element that I'll talk about is how we bring our team along as we do this research. Because if they're not on board with you, sometimes you will do wonderful research and nothing will happen because of it. So that's the second step, is first we figure out what we're trying to learn, then we figure out how we're going to learn it, and make sure that our teams are actually on board. The next step is, of course, the research itself, executing. This could be interviewing people, launching a survey. In my model here, it actually includes some of the participant recruitment that we have as well. And once you've got your interviews done, once you've talked to people or you get your survey response, the next step is analysis. What that means for us is actually just looking at the data that we've gathered. I think there's 2 steps that we need to separate, and that's analysis and synthesis. When you've interviewed people, when you've run a survey, the first question that you ask yourself is, what have I actually seen? Is my data valid? What biases were in it? So you do want to make sure that you actually step back and look at the nature of what you've collected before you go on to the next step and you synthesize it. And here's where we work with our teams to actually figure out what we should do with what we've seen. That's turning it into action. Finally, the most important step that in the example I told you about did not happen for me is follow through. When you've done a project, you've delivered your work, if nothing changes in the product because of it, does it matter that you did your work? I would say maybe no, unfortunately. And that's happened to me. So early on, as I was looking through this is the second question: what does it mean to grow as a researcher? I thought maybe this is what it looks like. Maybe when you're a junior researcher, you get little pieces of work, and first you just learn how to do the research and do the analysis. Someone hands you a task and they say, run a usability test on this thing. And so you own that little bit and you run your usability tests, and then you figure out what you saw, and that's kind of your scope. Then maybe when you level up as a researcher, you spent 2 or 3 years and you understand your methods, you understand how to collect your data. Then you can actually start to look at, okay, what is the right approach for this research? How do I approach the question at hand? And you go a little further on the other side, and you can actually say, what have I seen here? And what does that mean for the product? And then maybe you've done that for a couple years, and suddenly you actually start to understand how the product works. You know what the questions are that you should be asking, and you can actually work with your team to suggest the types of questions that you should be working on. Also, when you're more senior, maybe it goes all the way to the right, and you get to learn, or you get to push the team into actually acting. So this was sort of my first crack at saying, okay, what is it we're doing as researchers, and how do I progress to do that? We're going to modify it a little bit later, but first we'll take a look at something else that's important for us as researchers. Okay, so in summary of just this first little look, the research process is really a cyclical process of figuring out what do we need to learn and making sure that we can find the right answers to that and get our team to do stuff. And you can grow as a researcher by owning that process, by being able to move through it end to end and understanding how it works, by increasing your craft skills and also increasing your actual impact in the organization, learning how to work with people. So that's sort of the baseline. When we say someone is a researcher, from my point of view, that means someone who goes through that process. But there's a second piece to it all, which is experience. And I mentioned that we call ourselves user experience researchers, user researchers. What we're working with is a little bit different than many other types of research because we deal with humans acting and behaving with products. So this is kind of focused on a technological standpoint, but if you'll imagine for a minute that this is the world and that all of these little orange dots are ephemeral activities blinking on and off. So every little dot here might be a high schooler Snapchatting with their friends, a person buying a train ticket online, someone going to an airline service counter. Each time that someone interacts with technology, we could call it an experience. And that's how we'll frame it for this talk. So if we look at any single one of those things, we can say that an experience comes when two sides meet. There's us on the left and them on the right. So this is the simplest way to think about it. Maybe if you're a student, not yet, but most of us working on products and services are providing something that people are acting with to achieve a goal. And so you don't get the experience, this piece in the middle, until both of those sides come together. It's sort of you could say, a mutually co-evolving, ephemeral piece in time where you have this middle orange circle, and that's the experience. So there's something special about what this means when people interact with technology, and we're going to unpack what that looks like. Here is the first layer of that. The most apparent thing that you see when we work with an experience, on our side, for the us, there's a touch point on the left. On their side, for the them, there's behavior. So as we go through this model, you're going to look and see on the left everything that makes up what our service or product looks like, and you're going to see on the right everything that drives how people think and act with technology. All right, so behaviors first. Basically, whatever you observe is really the most important thing. What the core of an experience is, in our definition, is that person on the right interacting with something on the left. And for us, that could be, again, the service counter, the mobile app, the website. Any of these things could be our touch point. But you have to go a layer deeper because people act for certain reasons. They have goals and motivations, and they're trying to accomplish certain tasks. So as we talk about experience, we see the behavior meeting the touch point, but what's actually behind it on the right side is the fact that someone's trying to do something. And maybe that's, to follow the example, that's to book an airline ticket. Maybe it's to buy their groceries online. It could really be anything that you think your users are trying to do. And this is really important stuff for us as user researchers, because when we understand what people are attempting to accomplish, we can evaluate how well we're solving those needs or help determine what we need to build to actually solve those needs. That's on their side. So on our side on the left, there's something else that's behind the touch point. And there's a really nice book that Jorge Arango wrote called Living in Information. And he calls these things places made of information. And the idea essentially is that underneath the app, behind it, there's this conceptual digital place. So when you think about using something like Facebook, behind it, you could actually think that there's some abstract digital room or place. And you can think about this place and its structures just like you could a regular building. So it's not very far off from what information architects work with. But what's interesting is that the information environment needs to match people's goals and motivations. And an example of when that doesn't happen is if you've ever gone to the airline service counter and you ask them to change something on your ticket, and they say to you, "I'm sorry, the system won't let me do that." This is the system that's behind there, and it's an important conceptual way for us to think about what we provide. Because the surface of this thing is essentially the user interface, but what's behind it is what dictates the capabilities that we're providing for people to act on. One layer deeper, on the right is the real world context, if you will, and people's goals and motivations don't come out of nothing. They have families, they have communities, they live in a home, they have work, they have jobs, they're doing things for school. All of these factors, depending on what our scope is, dictate what their goals and needs are. So, as researchers, one of the ways that we can get to understanding people's goals and needs is by observing and understanding their real-world context and how those needs arise. On the left, another area that should be in balance is the organization itself. And when you think about that system and that structure that's behind your touch points, what generates that is your business, your organization, your government, nonprofit, whatever you may be working in. And it's all the way down to how your teams are organized, how your business units are organized, how people work together, the policies of the organization. There's a really nice concept called Conway's Law that essentially says, I won't formulate it exactly right, but any organization that produces a system is constrained to produce a system that is a copy of that organization's communication pathways. So, if you've heard the phrase, you're shipping your org chart, what that means is that the way that you organize your people actually dictates how your information environments are structured, which is then reflected in the way that people can work through your touch points. So this is almost the end of the model. This is all of the different pieces that make a user experience and that drive what actually happens at that moment of truth in the middle. But there is one other piece. If we could understand people's context, know their goals, and see their behavior, we could predict everything about how they'd act, theoretically. But the world doesn't work that easily, and that's because people come in with expectations and mental models. Everyone has their own little picture of how the world is and how your system works. And when that doesn't match, when they expect that something works differently, you'll have a bad time. Essentially, experience can break down when the two sides of the model don't balance, but also if what people think you provide, or if they have a certain model of how your system works, doesn't match the way that it does, they're going to encounter either usability errors or just not be able to do the thing that they're trying to do. So that's one messy element. And then, of course, there's another messy element on the other side, and that's that we as a company, we as an organization, have some picture of how the world is on their side. We have a model of what we think people need and they want. And what's in that model actually drives the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we build our places made of information, and how we design our touch points. So if our model of what's going on the user side doesn't match, we can encounter similar breakdowns because we're not providing the right type of capabilities in our service. Okay, it's been a little heavy. Are you mostly with me? Nice, nice. Okay, here's the full picture. So my hypothesis, and what I will try to provide you with, is this model as a picture of most of the things that you need to be aware about as a user experience researcher. If you understand how all these pieces fit and how well they balance, you'll be much more effective in going about figuring out what questions to ask and what evidence to provide your team for making design or product decisions. Okay, and that's what I just said. Same thing. We work with this system of experience, and the balances between each side and between our expectations and their expectations are what make good service experiences. But why is that important? It's a little bit different than any other type of pure academic research. But there's a very specific reason that we should have a picture like this. So we've got all these layers. The first layer in green, that closest layer, experience comes from action. It's driven by intent, and that intent is a product of context. Of course, with the messy emotions and expectations up top that are sort of the shadow drivers of it all. And here are a number of questions that we as researchers can ask, and there are some other questions that come about when you try to balance the different sides. But largely, a lot of our research is answering different variations of these types of questions about what's going on in an experience. Ooh, it didn't show up very well, but the other thing that we do is we try to figure out what's balanced between those various pieces. If the action layer is not balanced, if what they're trying to do isn't possible, the experience is going to break down, and so on through each of these other layers we've talked about. But what's important to think about here is that when we as organizations are building products and services for people, what drives what we build are the organizational assumptions that we have here. And when you're a small team, usually your implicit assumptions about how the world works is pretty close to reality. If you're a new product team, if you're a startup, maybe you're coming from an industry and building a product for it, you tend to understand who the people are, what they're trying to do, and the context that they're working in. That could be consumers in the real world, or it could be business people in an enterprise context. The problem is that as we grow, we drift. Or maybe you're founding a company and you're working and you don't have that picture. So all of a sudden, we lose sight of what's actually happening in experience, and what drives our expectations about how people act in the world are our expectations about how people act in the world. You get this sort of runaway spiral that turns into poor product experiences and service failures that tend to repeat themselves when you don't look at the evidence of experience on the ground. So I think that this is why our work is particularly important in a world where we have an increasing amount of technology in our lives, connected services bringing people together. Many companies very easily lose sight of what really happens in experience, or get a stilted picture of it because it's purely quantitative and they can't answer to the goals that people have or what they're actually doing. So this is your job as a researcher, essentially, is to figure out how to load the company or the organization's model with the right understanding of the user's side of an experience. Specifically, it's to figure out, what do I need to learn? What can I show and teach my company? And how can those pictures that I build help drive better product or design outcomes? So that's why I think it's really important that we see this picture and we understand what it looks like when it drifts. Working with experience is hard. Successful products come from good experiences. I think that's almost becoming common knowledge, and it's why you're all here today, because I think you too believe that when we build good experiences, we can build useful products and make technology suck somewhat less. And our organizations lose sight of this, and it's generally our job to wade into the messy waters of what people are doing in the world and figure out what to bring back. So I'll give you 3 sort of short little story bits of what this could look like. Each of these is going to be an example of a project that I've done, and then also a mindset that you could use to approach this work of uncovering what's over there on the right side of the model. So here we go. What does it mean to do research? We talked about the research process at first. We're going to bring that back a little bit, not too much, I promise. And the first one, the metaphor for this type of work is the researcher as a shepherd. So, back to the greatest usability study ever conducted and reported on. But nothing happened. And a little more context here. I was working with a company. I had been a contract designer, and they hired me on as a researcher because I seemed inquisitive and theoretically smart about this stuff. I went off, I got a designer. We found customers of our product. We rigorously recruited them. We gave them well-defined tasks. We observed them going through these tasks in our product. We analyzed the videos. We figured out every place where somebody didn't understand what was happening in that product. We noted it down. I've got pictures of the sticky notes here, so you can see that we did some real analysis and a little bit of synthesis. But there was something that was missing, and that was getting the team to care. So I'll talk a little bit about how you do that. Just a little more on usability studies. When we do usability studies, what you're essentially doing is checking the balance between what's happening in this layer of action. How does it work? How do they act? When those two things work well together, that's nice. But when they don't, which I think is almost always the case, we need to find those points and bring it to our team's attention so we can figure out how to correct it. In this case, just to draw out the model a little further, I was working with a family location web app and working with users trying to locate their family members. This was before phones had GPSs, back when we had to do it with cell tower triangulation, which means, like you could imagine, we ping that phone from a number of cell towers and then have a few hundred yards of accuracy with which we draw a circle on the map. So, big, interesting finding in World's Greatest Report was that people didn't understand where their kids were on the map. This is a real problem. I mean, if you're a researcher like me who cares about parents knowing where their kids are, it seems like actually an existential crisis for the product. Why did nobody care? And the problem was that I went off and I asked these questions and I found these problems, but nobody who had a stake in actually changing the way the product worked right now was there or bought in. And then I said to them, you guys, there are problems and they're your fault. So going back to this process, where I spent my time was not the place where I really should have. In this metaphor of the researcher as the shepherd, and when you're working with these layers of action where you're trying to build a picture of behavior, I think that the best way to do that is to have your team see it and to bring them along. And what that means is when you're doing this type of work, maybe even more important than any sort of report, I could have never written that report if I had actually socialized the plan for finding the answers and had my product managers and my engineers sitting in that usability test with me. Because you can be sure if they saw that parents trying to locate their kids for a family locator product couldn't figure out where their kids were, they'd probably care and do something about it. Now, in this example, the research itself was problematic because I wasn't aware of the engineering schedules. I wasn't aware of the organizational priorities. There's a lot more that goes into actually making this stuff actionable. So, when you are the shepherd, when you're doing these usability studies, the way that you can think about it is you're taking your flock to the source. You've got to bring these people, you've got to corral them in and let them see the problems themselves. Because I can't think of many ways to better present a problem that a user has with the product, especially when it's this discrete, except letting them see the problem the user has with the product. So early on, my mistake here was that I cared so deeply about the report, and maybe for the first time my college professors would have been proud that I wrote a nice report, but it doesn't do anything in the real world. So you've got to bring them to the source. You've got to be aware of the timeliness of your research. If you're doing a usability study and you haven't figured out where you are in your product development cycles or what's on the roadmap, you may be finding problems that the team is not ready to answer or is unwilling to commit to. So there's another layer there, and a lot of these things play together. I think one theme that you'll see through a couple of these examples is learning how to be aware of what the people around you are doing and what their priorities are is always crucial to making this work. And finally, it's socialized for relevance. If I had told our product managers and our engineers that we were doing this work, or just put a meeting on their calendar and said, I need you to come to 2 or 3 of these sessions, we're doing 15, they would have come, maybe begrudgingly at first, but you can make these requests of people and you can ask them to be there. That takes a little bit of personal gumption, especially if you're a new researcher, but you need to try it and you need to give them the opportunity to see what's happening on the ground. Okay, so that's the usability testing example. The next one is actually a project that worked, thankfully. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this idea of the researcher being a guide. So the shepherd is you bring them there. The guide is sort of, let's say, charting out the journey. So for this project, this was essentially the output of the project, and the outcome was that 2 different business units in a company were able to build a new and successful communication system between 2 sides of a platform. The platform was a delivery service app. People would shop on one side, it would send batches off to drivers on the other side. The drivers would go and shop for those items, and then they would bring them to the customer. Problem in this system was that the way that the drivers and the customers communicated really didn't exist. If you remember back to our information environments, we had a driver team and we had a shopper team, or a customer team. And those two teams didn't work together, and there were two separate apps, and there was no way for them to talk. So the role here as a researcher was essentially to illuminate what it looked like right now during the course of each of these two sides of the experience working together, building this picture, and then allowing the team to see for themselves that there was a big breakdown and to build a new system to connect both sides. So I'll walk you through that in a sec, but something that we haven't talked about that's really important is this idea of time. So what I showed you earlier of this model was a very static picture of experience. It's if you were to fill in any single one of those bubbles, you need to do it for a very discrete moment in time. But one of the most important tools that we have when we're really talking about what an experience is figuring out how to characterize it in its entirety, end to end. And this is an easy trick for you as a researcher to do, and when well developed, gets pretty deep into the area of service design, and I think you'll see some good connection there. But the questions that we can ask and answer and are uniquely suited to do that is, what is the experience over time? And the way that we do that is we look at our model, we figure out what's going on, we pick the right pieces to depict, we pick the right time scale, and we draw this picture. And we'll get a little more detailed on this in a sec, but first we'll start with an easy one. If you've seen Jared Spool's talk, It's a Great Time to Be an Experience Designer, one of the things that he highly recommends is doing a customer journey. And here's an example of a very large timescale customer journey. We're going from buying a product all the way to trying it, getting back to the store, getting service, and getting some type of resolution. Now what he's charting here is basically he's taken only the top right bubble of our model. This is the customer's emotion line. So T equals 1 for Jared Spool's model, the top right, he's basically saying, what is the customer feeling? And he charts that out with buying product. Go back to T equals 2, and now we're trying a product, and we observe that experience over time. Another great trick that he recommends is you actually have an executive sit in on your usability studies, or a team member sit in on your usability studies, and do this for the steps that a user takes while they're going through a task in your product. It's a trick that really would have helped me in some of my earlier work. So that's the simple version of it. Here's the thing that I built in that model that I just showed you. So same model, just blown up a little bit, because you can see that we have two different teams that are producing two different apps. So if this model was really accurate, you'd see that the information environment on the left would have a split down it. They're sort of working for the same company, but there's two different parts there. There's the customer side, and there's the driver side. Now what we're playing with on the other side of the model is customers have made an order, their behavior is checking in on the order progress. Right now there's not actually a way to do that, and the drivers had to call them. That was the problem that we uncovered, is that customers want visibility and control for changes to their order. They could be anywhere in the world, and the driver's calling them. Sometimes they miss that call. It means the driver doesn't have the right information about what they should do to replace or not replace various items, and it means the customer is really frustrated. So down here on the bottom, working with that same model, we've got a driver who is using their driver app as a shopping checklist. They're trying to shop for the correct items quickly and find good replacement items, and they're incentivized here by the time that the order takes. It's literally how they make their money, and they're in a hectic and busy store where we say to them, go off somewhere near the checkout line and call that customer. So this was the model of experience, and actually I have tried to show you sort of roughly what the diagram that I showed initially was. Take those two different parts, you got the driver app and the customer app, sort of split it down the middle, keep rotating them. You can build a little picture of what's going on each of these touch points, on the driver side on the bottom, on the customer side on the top. We reintroduce the experience over time, and we build something like this. So what you're looking at is the customer and their interaction with the customer app on the top two rails. The system itself, the information environment that moves between both of them, is the middle rail. And what the shopper is doing with the shopper app, shopper's behavior is the bottom rail, and the shopper app touchpoint is the second higher bottom rail. Okay, so that's the model. And now, this successful project actually didn't take a lot of research itself, because we were able to chart out a lot of what we already knew, but nobody had put together to answer this question: what is the experience over time? What was extremely powerful that nobody in the team had really seen before was understanding this end-to-end flow and making it tangible meant that we could literally write on there, something's broken here. We could see this back and forth in these waiting periods over here. So in this case, where you focus when you're doing this researcher as guide, this journey mapping activity, is you really think about the analysis and the synthesis more. There may be data on hand, or the data itself, as you're conducting the research, is pretty straightforward because you're just watching what's happening over time. But the ability to build that picture, to analyze it, and then know what you see and build it into this map, suddenly changes quite a bit about how people think about what problems exist. So there's number 2, researcher as guide. One other way that we can work is we introduce this idea of experience over time. Visualizing this stuff is really powerful, and I will encourage you in whatever work you may be doing to try this, because in the simplest form, this is you with a piece of paper, a few dots and a few labels and arrows connecting them. Like, that is the base for any of these diagrams, for any of this work. But it's something that you can see could be built into a very complex artifact. And if you search user experience journey map or service blueprint, you'll find a wide variety of very complex models that essentially take parts of experience and just run them through over time. Okay, next thing is targeting the correct time scale. If I had built that model and talked about the phases of shopping, if my model showed you what happened when a customer placed an order and that then a driver went to the store, that then a customer got their order, it wouldn't have illuminated the communication problem. So you've got to think about what steps are we working with? What's the right time scale here? And in this case, it was a discrete behavior of person working with app and how those two played together. And finally, selecting the right parts of experience. In this model that I showed you, what was important for me was being able to show the fact that there's quite a bit of interplay with the app on each side, but there wasn't a good connection between them. Okay, that's the researcher as guide. And finally, researcher as interpreter. We'll go through this one a little quickly, but when you do work to model goals, that middle layer on the right, you're essentially trying to interpret what is happening in the user's world and turn it into something that's useful for business needs. So I'll talk about personas. Personas and jobs to be done are probably the 2 main tools that we as user experience professionals use to model out people's goals and needs. I will show you this persona project, which on the surface looks great. It's not as groundbreaking as that usability report, but still looks really nice, really did that research. Problem was, it didn't change much in the product. It helped people understand our customers, but I didn't see any meaningful change in the product for the team that I was supporting because of it. So, personas, jobs to be done, whatever it is you're doing, again, you're trying to understand people's goals and motivations. You're asking the question, what are they trying to achieve? And what eventually you're doing is balancing that with what do our systems enable. When you've modeled those goals appropriately, you can determine whether or not you should solve them. So in this case, similar company, users shopping for delivery items were what we saw. The goals, weren't sure. What are the drivers for their patterns of behavior? And the real world, we were wondering which contexts dictate which goals, what behavior. So I'll go back to the personas real quick, just so you can see them. An important piece of any persona, when you do it well, is that you've modeled their goals and also have some accompanying scenarios to play those goals through. I think one thing that we miss when we do personas in a very lightweight manner is that we don't accompany the picture of the goals and context with those scenarios, because you need to be able to understand what time you're working with so that you can essentially play a persona's goals through the scenario. So you're building a different tool, kind of like the one we talked about previously, that will help you figure out what happens if this person is trying to achieve this thing in this specific scenario. So here was some of our analysis for these personas. Essentially, when you're doing these things, you take your interviews, your observations, and you look at different behavioral variables. In this case, you can see that some of my behavioral variables were huge number of specific stores versus shops where convenient. Are there certain places I need to go? Are there certain very specific things I'm looking for? Or am I just like, I need one specific item and I can get it wherever? So, I'm going to speed this one up a little bit. Essentially what happened was, I chose the wrong types of behaviors to observe. The product team that I was working with was only working on the consumer storefront. What they cared about, what the product manager was trying to do, was to change the way that people search for items within a specific store. So he was on board with the idea of personas. He didn't understand how they would turn into useful goals. But what I did was give him a model that would help him design new ways to present different stores, or ways to present different delivery window options based on what people were looking for. So we got these really pretty pictures that had well-developed goals and interesting scenarios about when they would shop, but the granularity was wrong. I built my goals on the level of how people would choose which stores and when they were shopping, and not at the granularity that my product manager was looking for, which was, how do people pick the specific items they're looking for when they've chosen their store? So, what I missed in that project, and I think what's most important when you're trying to interpret people's needs for business strategy, is the actionable research questions. This is where it's really important to understand what your team is trying to build and what's on their roadmap. Otherwise, you'll miss the follow-through, like I did. Now I know we ended up using those personas for a while to help onboard the team and help them understand who our customers were and what types of things they needed, but the type of outcomes that I'm looking for as a researcher are making our product better. And there was a lot of work here that took a long time and did not immediately or tangibly make the product better. So when you're the interpreter, you need to understand your team's drivers and their user needs. You figure out the intersection to get leverage, and then you can model and build your foundational understanding. So get the level of needs right based on what your team is trying to do. I am going to very quickly revisit this old model that I showed you. I told you that this is how I thought researchers grew. I think in the abstract, it's still right to some degree. We learn how to execute and analyze what we've seen. We grow and we learn how to approach the research and how to make sense of it. And eventually we figure out how to pull the right questions and build follow-through. But what I think you do is, as a researcher, first you learn how to do it on a pretty small scale. You learn how to go through this process at the layer of action. And then you can probably predict what's next. I think it's not a direct sequential progression, but you learn how to do this process and you get to learn more about the foundational research. You work with people's goals and motivations. It's a lot harder to build useful personas or tools if you don't understand what it looks like when people interact with technology at a base layer. And finally, of course, as you move into a more strategic role, you learn how to go through that process in the larger and widest layers of context. So that's what it looks like to grow as a researcher. This is the current thinking, at least, as you move through these layers of experience. And finally, let's go back to what does it mean to do research. This is a closing. This, as a spoiler, is not the answer. This is what I thought the answer was early on. I thought I was doing great research, talking to customers, writing reports. That's bad. Your job is to understand what is going on here, check for where the balance is, where it doesn't match, figure out what you need to learn so that you can help your team move forward, and then you can build actionable pictures that drive impact by having your team come along with a shared understanding. So what you really want to do is learn about something specific so you can create a specific outcome. There, as a researcher, you find these meaningful questions, gaps in knowledge, and understand how the answers will advance the work. You're building these pictures of actionable areas of experience, and you connect your team to this larger reality to build alignment and drive action. And that's it. here, this is on the internet. If you want to read further, here are some books that have built this picture for me, and each of them are roughly aligned to the area of the model that they will help you understand. So check that out. You can find it all right here. That model, those books, a couple other things, the article Roy talked about. I was going to plug the Research Ops community. We're doing right now a set of researcher skills workshops. Just look for that online and you will find some interesting stuff. I won't go into details since I'm a little over. There we go. We've got a few minutes for Q&A.